The Galactic Council had ruled the stars for 12,000 years, and in all that time, every problem had been solved the same way, through bargains, through trades, through the careful exchange of concessions, until all parties walked away with something they wanted. This was the foundation of galactic peace, the sacred tradition that had prevented wars between empires and kept the fragile order of civilization intact across 10,000 star systems. Every species that joined the council learned this lesson quickly. You give something, you get something, and nobody leaves empty-handed. It was elegant, it was efficient, and it had worked without fail for longer than most species had existed. Then humanity entered the galactic stage, and everything began to change. Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood on the observation deck of the UNSS Defiance, watching the blue-green sphere of Kepler 442b rotate slowly beneath her ship. She was a tall woman in her 50s, with gray streaking through her dark hair and eyes that had seen too many hard negotiations to be surprised by anything anymore. Behind her, the door opened and her aide, Lieutenant Commander David Park, stepped through with a datapad clutched in his hands. His face was pale and his hands were shaking slightly. "Ambassador," he said, his voice tight with worry, "we have received a formal summons from the Galactic Council." Elena did not turn from the window. "What do they want?" "They are demanding our presence at Axiom Prime to address what they call the Helix Carter incident." Now Elena turned, and her expression was calm, but her eyes had grown sharp. The Helix Carter incident had happened 3 weeks ago when a human convoy had encountered 3 Vorthani patrol ships attempting to board a refugee transport. The transport had been carrying 40,000 Selvani, civilians' families fleeing the destruction of their homeworld. Children and elderly and sick people packed into cargo holds because they had nowhere else to go. The Vorthani had demanded the transport surrender its passengers to be processed, which everyone knew was a polite word for enslavement. Captain Marcus Chun of the UNSS Righteous had refused when the Vorthani opened fire on the transport. Chun had destroyed all 3 patrol ships in less than 4 minutes. It had been fast, brutal, and absolutely necessary. What are the Vorthani demanding? Elena asked. David swallowed hard and looked at his datapad. They want 10 of our colony worlds transferred to their control as compensation for their lost ships and crews. Elena raised an eyebrow but said nothing. They want complete technical specifications of our fleet, including weapon systems and defensive capabilities. Still Elena waited, and they want Captain Chun surrendered to them for execution. The silence in the room stretched for a long moment. David shifted uncomfortably, clearly expecting an explosion of anger. But Elena simply walked to her desk and sat down. "Tell the council we will attend," she said calmly. David blinked in surprise. "Ambassador, these demands are insane. Surely we cannot even consider." "I did not say we would consider them," Elena interrupted, and a small smile crossed her face. "I said we would attend." She picked up the datapad and scrolled through the formal summons, reading the elaborate language of galactic diplomacy with its careful phrases and hidden threats. "The Vorthani think they can bully us because we are new and small," she said. "And the council thinks they can pressure us into a compromise because that is how things have always worked. Can they not?" David asked quietly. "Ambassador, I have studied the council records. No species has ever successfully refused to bargain. They always find a way to make you give something up." Elena set the datapad down and looked at her aide with something like pity mixed with determination. "David, do you know why humans have survived as long as we have? Our technology, our adaptability." "No," Elena shook her head. "We have survived because there are some things we refuse to sell. Some principles we will not trade away no matter the cost. The Vorthani wanted us to hand over 40,000 innocent people to slavery, and they think we should apologize for saying no." She stood and walked back to the window, looking out at the stars. The galaxy has forgotten that some things are not for bargaining. Perhaps it is time we reminded them. 3 days later, the UNSS Defiance dropped out of faster-than-light travel in orbit around Axiom Prime. The ancient station that served as the seat of the Galactic Council, the station was enormous, a structure the size of a small moon, covered in towers and domes and docking ports for ships from 1,000 different species. Elena watched it grow larger on the view screen and felt a strange calm settle over her. Behind her, the rest of the human delegation had assembled 12 people in total, all wearing the formal black uniforms of Earth's diplomatic corps. There was no gold braid, no medals, no elaborate decorations like the other species favored. Just simple black cloth and the small blue Earth emblem on their shoulders. Ambassador, the communications officer reported. Axiom Prime Control is demanding we identify ourselves and state our business. Tell them Ambassador Elena Vasquez of the United Nations of Earth is here to answer the Council summons. There was a pause as the message was transmitted, and then a response came back. Dripping with condescension, even through the translator, human vessel. You are directed to docking port 773 in the Outer Ring. Suitable accommodations for junior species have been prepared. Elena smiled slightly at the insult hidden in that assignment. The Outer Ring was where they put delegations they wanted to forget about. Far from the center of power, acknowledge and comply, she told the helmsman. We did not come here to fight about parking spaces. As the ship glided toward the station, David moved to stand beside her. The council session begins tomorrow morning, he said. The Vorthani delegation arrived 2 days ago and have been meeting with other powers. Reports suggest they are building a coalition to pressure us. Of course they are, Elena replied. That is how the game is played. Ambassador, I have to ask, what is our strategy here? What leverage do we have against 600 species and 12,000 years of tradition? Elena was quiet for a moment, watching Axiom Prime fill the view screen. And when she spoke, her voice was soft but filled with absolute certainty. We do not need leverage, David. Then what do we have? Something they have forgotten exists, she said. We have the word no. The docking clamps engaged with a gentle thud, and the delegation began moving toward the airlock. Elena straightened her uniform, took a deep breath, and prepared to walk into the heart of galactic civilization. She knew that every species in the council expected her to play by their rules, to calculate the odds, to make the smart compromise that would save her people from a war they could not win. They expected humanity to be reasonable. They were going to be very disappointed. The Great Chamber of Axiom Prime was a space designed to humble visitors and remind them of their insignificance. The ceiling rose so high that clouds sometimes formed near the top, and the walls were covered with holographic displays showing the 600-member species of the Galactic Council in all their diversity and power. Massive stone benches circled the central speaking platform in rising tiers, each section reserved for different delegations based on their importance and seniority. The humans had been assigned seats near the very back, almost against the wall, where they would have to strain to see the proceedings. Ambassador Elena Vasquez led her delegation through the great doors and felt 600 species turn to look at them. The chamber fell into a strange half-silence, conversations dropping to whispers as the newcomers made their way to their assigned section. Elena walked with her head held high, meeting the stares of beings that towered over her, slithered past her, or floated through the air on wings of light. She showed no fear because she felt none. Look at them, a Krethri delegate rumbled to his companion, his voice carrying in the acoustic space. So small, so fragile, so certain they matter. Elena heard and did not react. The 12 humans took their seats and waited as the chamber slowly filled with the rest of the delegations. The Vorthani arrived in a formation of 20, their reptilian bodies covered in ceremonial armor that gleamed under the chamber lights. Their leader, High Ambassador Ketharon, was enormous even by Vorthani standards. His scales a deep crimson that marked him as a member of their warrior caste. He looked toward the human section and let his lips pull back to show rows of sharp teeth in what might have been a smile or a threat. Finally, the lights dimmed and a column of brilliant plasma descended from the ceiling to hover above the central platform. This was High Arbiter Zelithkin, one of the Ethereans' beings of living energy who had helped found the Council. Millennia ago, his voice resonated through the chamber without any visible source, filling every corner with its ancient authority. "The Galactic Council is now in session," he announced. "We have gathered to address a matter of grave concern, an act of aggression by the species, known as humanity against the Vorthani hegemony." Elena listened to the formal recitation of charges without changing her expression. According to the Vorthani version of events, Captain Chun had launched an unprovoked attack on peaceful patrol vessels conducting lawful operations in the Helix Corridor. There was no mention of the refugee transport, no mention of the 40,000 Sylvani, no mention of the demand for their surrender. The Vorthani hegemony requests that the Council hear their demands for restitution. Zelithkin continued, "I, Ambassador Ketharon, you may speak." The massive reptilian rose and strode to the speaking platform, his clawed feet clicking against the ancient stone. "Honored delegates," he began, his translator rendering his hissing voice into standard galactic. "Humanity has committed an act of war against our great hegemony. They have murdered 300 of our finest warriors without provocation or warning." Murmurs of concern rippled through the chamber. "We do not seek conflict," Ketharon continued, spreading his arms in a gesture of false reasonableness. "We are a peaceful people who desire only justice. Therefore, we present our terms for resolution." He activated a holographic display that listed the Vorthani demands in harsh red text. 10 colony worlds, complete fleet specifications. The surrender of Captain Marcus Chun for public execution. These terms are more than fair, Ketharon declared. They represent mercy, not punishment. Any other empire would demand the complete subjugation of humanity for such an offense. He turned to look directly at the human delegation, his eyes glittering with malice. "We await humanity's response." Every being in the chamber turned to look at the small group of humans in black uniforms seated against the back wall. Elena rose slowly, straightened her jacket, and walked down the long aisle toward the speaking platform. She could feel the weight of countless eyes upon her. The judgment of species who had negotiated in this chamber for thousands of years. When she reached the platform, she looked up at the towering form of Ketharon and the floating plasma of High Arbiter Zelithkin. And she did not bow. "I thank the Council for the opportunity to speak," she said, her voice clear and steady. "And I thank the Vorthani for presenting their version of events so thoroughly." She paused and activated her own holographic display. The chamber gasped as the image appeared, not charts or documents, but a recording from the cargo hold of the refugee transport Salvani families huddled together in the dim light. Children crying, parents trying to comfort them with fear written across their faces. "This is what the Vorthani call lawful operations," Elena said quietly. 40,000 refugees fleeing genocide, packed into cargo holds because they had nowhere else to go. The recording continued, showing the moment when the Vorthani patrol ships appeared, and their commander's face filled the screen with his demand that the transport surrender its passengers for processing. Processing. Elena repeated the word with cold precision, a pleasant term for slavery. These people had already lost their homeworld, their families, their everything. And the Vorthani wanted to take what little they had left. She looked at Ketharon, who had begun to shift uncomfortably. Captain Chen refused, Elena continued. He told the Vorthani that Earth does not surrender refugees to slavers. When they opened fire on the transport, he ended the threat. The chamber erupted in noise, some species protesting, others demanding order, still others engaging in rapid conversations with their neighbors. High Arbiter Zeloth can raise one tendril of plasma, and the chamber fell silent. "Ambassador Vasquez," he said, "the events you describe are not part of the official record. Do you have evidence to support these claims?" "I have the complete sensor logs from the transport and from the UNSS Righteous," Elena replied. "I have testimony from Captain Chun and his crew. I have statements from 7,000 Selvani refugees who witnessed the Vortheni demands. I will provide all of this to the Council for review." Ketharon's scales had flushed a darker shade of red. "These are lies," he hissed. "Fabrications designed to distract from humanity's crimes." "Then, you will not object to an independent investigation," Elena said calmly. "Let neutral observers examine all the evidence and determine the truth." For a moment, something like fear flickered in Ketharon's eyes before his expression hardened. "The Vorthani hegemony does not require investigation," he growled. "We require justice. Our demands stand." Elena turned to face the assembled delegates, her voice rising to fill the chamber. "The Vorthani want us to hand over 10 colony worlds filled with human families. They want the specifications of our fleets so they can destroy us at their leisure. They want Captain Chen executed for the crime of protecting innocent people." She shook her head slowly. "Humanity declines." The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. "We will not surrender our worlds." Elena continued. "We will not reveal our defenses. We will not punish a man for doing what was right. The Vorthani demands are rejected, completely and without reservation." Zelothkin's plasma form flickered with what might have been surprise. "Ambassador Vasquez, perhaps you do not understand how council proceedings work. This is merely the opening of negotiations. Surely there is some middle ground that can be found." "No," Elena said simply. "You must offer something," the Arbiter pressed. "That is how disputes are resolved. Concession and counter-concession until agreement is reached." "High Arbiter," Elena replied, "with great respect, there are some things that cannot be bargained. We will not trade away innocent lives to satisfy the pride of slavers. This is not a negotiating position, it is a fact." The chamber descended into chaos. 600 species shouting and gesturing and demanding explanations. How could this tiny species refuse to bargain? Did they not understand the power arrayed against them? Were they suicidal or simply insane? Elena stood in the center of the storm, unmoved, and waited for silence to return when Zelothkin finally restored order. His voice carried a note of warning. "Ambassador, humanity is young and perhaps does not appreciate the consequences of intransigence. The Vorthani hegemony commands vast fleets and countless warriors. If you refuse all compromise, there may be war. Then there will be war," Elena answered. And her voice did not waver. "But we will not buy peace with the lives of refugees." She turned and walked back to her seat, leaving the great chamber in stunned silence. No species had ever simply refused to play the game until now. The days that followed were unlike anything the Galactic Council had experienced. In 12,000 years, every species on Axiom Prime seemed to have the same mission: convince the humans to bargain. Delegations arrived at the human quarters at all hours, representing every imaginable interest and philosophy. The Morvathi came first, slithering through the corridors with their serpentine bodies and whispering voices that promised secret knowledge in exchange for flexibility. "We understand your position," their lead negotiator hissed. "But consider a reasonable compromise. Surrender only 5 colony worlds instead of 10, perhaps in a region you do not value. The Vorthani will accept, and you will preserve the rest." Ambassador Alan Esquez received them politely in the small conference room that served as humanity's diplomatic headquarters. "Thank you for your concern," she replied. "But we will not surrender any colony worlds. Those planets are home to millions of people who trust Earth to protect them." The Morvathi exchanged confused glances. "But they are merely outer territories," one protested. "Surely the sacrifice of a few to save the many is logical." "Not to us," Elena said. The Morvathi left frustrated, unable to comprehend a species that refused to make calculations about which of their own people were expendable. Next came the Krethri, massive beings that towered over the humans and spoke with rumbling voices that shook the walls. Their approach was more direct. "Little ones," their ambassador growled, leaning close enough that Elena could smell the sharp chemical scent of his breath. "You are making a grave mistake. The Vorthani have friends, powerful friends who will not stand idle while you embarrass them before the council." "Is that a threat?" Elena asked calmly. "It is a fact," the Krethri replied. "Give them something, anything, and this matter can be settled. Refuse, and you will face consequences beyond your imagination." "We have faced consequences before," Elena said. "And we are still here." The Krethri stared at her for a long moment, then shook his massive head and departed. "They are insane," he muttered to his colleagues as they left. "Completely insane." On the fifth day, a delegation from the Synthesis Collective arrived, crystalline beings who claimed to have calculated 17,000 possible compromise configurations. They displayed their proposals on shimmering holographic matrices, each one representing a different balance of concessions that they assured would satisfy all parties. Configuration 7,422 shows. "Particular promise," their speaker chimed. "If humanity agrees to share navigational data for the outer rim sectors, provide symbolic reparations in the form of cultural artifacts, and issues a formal statement of regret, the Vorthani have a 63% probability of accepting reduced terms." Elena studied the complex diagram and shook her head. "We have nothing to regret," she said. "Captain Chun saved 40,000 lives. That is not something we will apologize for, but the mathematics are irrelevant." Elena interrupted gently. "This is not a math problem. It is a question of right and wrong." The collective flickered in confusion and eventually withdrew to recalculate. Even the neutral powers attempted to intervene. High Arbiter Zeleth summoned Elena to a private meeting in his chambers on the 12th day. The room was filled with swirling plasma that moved in patterns too complex for human eyes to follow. And Zeleth Khan's voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Ambassador Vasquez," he began, "I have served as arbiter for 3,000 years, and I have never seen anything like this." "Like what, arbiter?" "A species that simply refuses to engage," he replied. "Do you not understand what you are doing? The Council exists to prevent war, to find solutions that all parties can accept. By refusing to bargain, you are undermining the very foundation of galactic peace." Elena stood in the center of the swirling energy, her black uniform stark against the dancing lights. "Arbiter, with respect, I understand exactly what I am doing," she said. "You have built a system where every conflict is resolved by making everyone give something up, and it has worked, mostly. But there is a flaw in your system. And what is that?" "You have made compromise mandatory," Elena explained, "which means that aggression is rewarded. The Vorthani tried to enslave 40,000 innocent people, and your system demands that we, the ones who stopped them, must pay a price. That is not peace, it is the management of injustice." Zelethkin's plasma form pulsed with agitation. "You speak of justice, but what is justice worth if it leads to war? The Vorthani will not back down, and they have allies who see humanity's defiance as a threat to the established order. If you persist, there will be conflict. Then there will be conflict. Elena said, "You would sacrifice your entire species for a principle." Elena was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was soft but absolute. "Arbiter, do you know what happened on Earth before we reached the stars? We fought wars that killed hundreds of millions, wars over land and power and ideology. We nearly destroyed ourselves more than once. Then you understand the cost of conflict. I understand that some of those wars were necessary." Elena interrupted. "I understand that there were moments in our history when refusing to compromise, refusing to accept injustice, was the only right choice. We did not survive by always being reasonable. We survived by knowing when to fight." Zelthkin drifted closer. His ancient consciousness studying this small human was something like wonder. "The Vorthani outnumber you 1,000 to 1, he said. "Their fleet is 10 times the size of yours. Even with your strange courage, you cannot win." "Perhaps not," Elena admitted. "Perhaps they will come with their vast armada and burn Earth to ash. Perhaps humanity will become a footnote in galactic history. A cautionary tale about the foolishness of standing on principle." She met the Arbiter's glowing gaze without flinching. "But here is what else will happen," she continued. "Every species in this council will watch. Every oppressed population, every refugee group, every small power that has been forced to accept unjust bargains for 1,000 generations. They will all see what your council does when a species chooses to die rather than betray its values." Elena took a step closer to the ancient being. "How many bargains will you broker after that, Arbiter? How many species will trust you justice when they know that Earth was destroyed for protecting refugees? Your system depends on everyone believing that the Council is fair. That compromise serves everyone. But if we burn, that belief burns with us." Zelthkin was silent for a long time, his plasma form flickering with colors that had no names in any human language. "You would use your own destruction as a weapon," he said finally. "We would use it as a mirror," Elena corrected, "to show the galaxy what the Council truly is." The Arbiter made a sound that might have been a sigh. "I have lived for 30,000 years, Ambassador, and I have seen countless species rise and fall. I thought I understood the patterns of galactic civilization, the rhythms that govern how empires and peoples behave." His form dimmed slightly. "I did not anticipate humans. No one ever does," Elena said, and something like a smile crossed her face. "That is rather the point." She turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "Arbiter, I do not want war. I do not want my people to die. But I will not purchase peace by handing over innocents to slavery or punishing a good man for doing his duty. If the Council cannot find justice without demanding that we betray our principles, then your system is already broken." She walked out into the corridor, leaving the ancient being alone with his swirling thoughts behind her. Zelthkin stared at the closed door for a very long time in 30,000 years. He had never felt uncertain about the Council's purpose now. For the first time, he wondered if a species barely 3 centuries old had seen something his ancient wisdom had missed. On the 18th day, the Great Chamber assembled for what everyone expected to be the final session. The Vorthani had grown tired of waiting, and High Ambassador Ketharon had made it clear that if humanity did not accept their demands, he would formally request the Council's authorization for military action. The chamber was more crowded than Elena had ever seen it. Every seat filled with delegates eager to witness the humiliation of the stubborn little species that had dared to defy 12,000 years of tradition. Ambassador Vasquez led her delegation to their seats in the back with the same quiet dignity she had shown since arriving, if she felt the weight of what was about to happen. She gave no sign. Ketharon rose and strode to the speaking platform, his crimson scales gleaming with obvious satisfaction. "Honored delegates," he announced. 18 days ago, humanity was given the opportunity to make amends for their crimes. They have refused every reasonable offer, rejected every path to peace, and insulted the dignity of the Vorthani hegemony with their arrogance. He turned to face the human section, his teeth bared in triumph. Today, we ask the Council to recognize humanity's intransigence and authorize the hegemony to seek justice through other means. The chamber buzzed with anticipation. This was how it always ended. With the stubborn party finally broken by the weight of galactic pressure, everyone expected Elena to rise, to make one final desperate offer, to finally begin the bargaining that should have happened from the beginning. Instead, it was a different voice that rang out across the chamber. The Silvani delegation requests the right to speak. Every head turned toward a small group of beings seated in the observer's gallery thin. Delicate creatures with silver skin and large dark eyes, who had sat in silence throughout the entire proceedings. They were refugees, survivors of a dying world, and they had no voting rights in the council. They had no power at all. But Eldekorath, their ancient leader, had risen to his feet, and his voice carried across the chamber with surprising strength. "We have listened," he said, "for 18 days. We have listened as great powers debated what should be done about the humans who saved our people. We have listened as the Vorthani demanded punishment for the crime of compassion." He stepped forward, his frail body trembling but his eyes burning with something fierce. 40,000 of our people live today because a human captain refused to hand them over to slavers. Our children breathe because humanity said no when every rule of this council demanded they say yes. Catharone's scales flushed dark with anger. The Silvani have no standing here. He snarled, "You are observers, nothing more." "We are witnesses," Korath replied, his voice rising, "witnesses to what humanity truly is, and witnesses to what this council has become." He turned to face the assembled delegates, spreading his thin arms wide. "For 200 years, my people begged this council for protection as our world was poisoned by war and corporate exploitation. We came to this very chamber and pleaded for intervention, for justice, for mercy. And what did we receive?" His voice cracked with old grief. "Compromises, bargains, carefully calculated agreements that always left us with less than we needed, and our oppressors with more than they deserved. Your great system of peace allowed my people to die slowly while everyone congratulated themselves on finding middle ground." The chamber had gone utterly silent. Then humanity came. Korath continued, "Young and small and unimportant by your standards. And when they saw our people in danger, they did not calculate the odds. They did not weigh the political consequences. They simply acted because it was right." He turned to face the human delegation, and tears were streaming down his silver face. "Ambassador Vasquez." "Elder to Ambassador, I am authorized to speak for all surviving Silvani. We reject the Vorthani claims. We stand with humanity." The chamber erupted in shocked murmurs. But Korath was not finished, and we call upon every species in this chamber that has ever been forced to accept unjust bargains. Every people who has watched their children suffer because the council demanded compromise with their oppressors, stand with us. Stand with humanity. Stand for something more than political convenience. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a single figure rose in the Meridani section, a tall being covered in iridescent feathers, who had not spoken once during the entire proceedings. "The Meridani remember," she said, her voice carrying across the silent chamber. "We remember when the Vorthani conquered our outer colonies 3 centuries ago. We remember the bargains we were forced to accept, the people we were told to sacrifice for peace." She straightened her plumage in a gesture of defiance. "The Meridani stand with humanity." Another delegation rose to Calith. Small amphibious beings who had long been considered insignificant. The Calith were nearly driven to extinction by the Vorthani, 2,000 years ago. Their speaker croaked. We survived only by accepting terms that haunt us to this day. If humanity will not bow to this injustice, neither will we. The Caliph stand with humanity. One by one, more delegations rose to Vestrani, who had lost their homeworld to Vorthani expansion, the subtle ones, whose trade routes had been seized through council-approved bargains, the children of distant suns. Refugees who had wandered for generations seeking a home, 17 species in total, stood with humanity's small powers. Subjugated peoples, the voiceless who had always been, told to accept what the great empires offered. It was not a majority. It was not even close to enough to tip the balance of power in the council, but it was something that had never happened before Catharos. Scales had gone pale with shock and fury. This is insurrection, he roared. This is a violation of council protocol. These minor species have no right. They have every right. Elena's voice cut through his tirade as she finally rose from her seat. They have the right to choose. They have the right to say no. They have the right to stand for their principles instead of trading them away. She walked down the long aisle toward the speaking platform. But she did not stop there. She continued until she stood among the Selvani, among the Meridani, among all the small and forgotten peoples who had chosen this moment to remember their dignity. High Ambassador Catharon, she said, turning to face the Vorthani, you came here expecting to bully a young species into submission. You expected us to calculate the odds and realize we could not win. And you were right. We cannot defeat your fleets. We cannot match your numbers. She gestured to the delegation standing around her. But look at what you have done. Look at what your demands have created. For the first time in 12,000 years, the voiceless have found their voice. The forgotten have remembered their worth. You wanted to make an example of humanity, and you have, but not the example you intended. High Arbiter Ziloth drifted down from his position above the chamber, his plasma form swirling with colors no one had ever seen before. This session is unprecedented, he said, his ancient voice heavy with something that might have been wonder. The council must adjourn to consider these developments. There is nothing to consider. Catharon screamed. These are minor powers with no real influence. The hegemony demands. The hegemony will wait, Zelethkin interrupted, and his voice carried the weight of 30,000 years. Something has changed today, High Ambassador. Something fundamental. And I am not yet certain what it means. He turned his attention to Elena. Ambassador Vasquez, you have done something I did not believe possible. You have made the council question itself. Elena met his gaze steadily. That was never my intention, Arbiter. I simply told the truth and refused to pretend that wrong was right. Yes, Zelethkin said slowly. And perhaps that is exactly what we needed. The chamber began to empty. Delegations streaming toward the exits in a buzz of confused conversation. But the 17 species who had stood remained, gathered around the small human delegation. United by something that had no name but felt like hope, Elder Korath approached Elena, his ancient hands reaching out to clasp hers. Whatever happens next, he said, you have given us something precious. What is that? Elena asked. The memory of what courage looks like, he replied. We had forgotten. Now we will never forget again. Elena looked at the old Selvani, at the gathered delegates from a dozen different worlds, at the shattered expectations of a galactic civilization that had believed itself unchangeable. Neither will they, she said quietly, looking toward the exit where the great powers had fled to recalculate their assumptions. And that changes everything. The war that everyone expected never came. For 3 days after the extraordinary session, the Vorthani hegemony remained silent. Their delegation locked in their quarters while urgent communications flashed between Axiom Prime and the hegemony's homeworld, the 17. Species who had stood with humanity met each day in the human quarters, crowded into rooms too small for their numbers, sharing food and stories and the strange exhilaration of having finally said what they had always wanted to say. Elena moved among them, listening more than speaking, watching bonds form between peoples who had never thought they had anything in common. On the fourth day, High Arbiter Zelethkin requested a private meeting with Ambassador Vasquez. Elena found him in his chambers, his plasma form dimmer than usual, swirling with slow patterns that suggested deep thought. "The Vorthani have made their decision," he said. Without greeting, Elena felt her heart quicken, but kept her expression calm. "And what have they decided?" "They are withdrawing their demands," Zelethkin replied. "All of them? No colony worlds, no fleet specifications, no execution. The Helix corridor will remain open to all traffic, including refugee transports. And the hegemony will not interfere for a moment." Elena could not speak. She had prepared herself for war, for the destruction of everything she loved, for a noble defeat that might inspire others, even as it ended her species. She had not prepared for victory. Why? She finally managed. "Because you were right," Zelethkin said, "about everything." The hegemony's military analysts calculated the cost of war against humanity, not just in ships and soldiers, but in reputation, in alliances, in the stability of their empire. He drifted closer, his ancient consciousness studying her. They realized that destroying Earth would mean destroying themselves. Not immediately, not directly, but inevitably. Every species in the Council saw what happened in that chamber. Every oppressed population heard about the 17 who stood. If the Vorthani burned humanity for protecting refugees, how long before their own subject peoples began to wonder if they too could say no? Elena sat down heavily in one of the human chairs, her legs suddenly weak, so they backed down out of fear, out of calculation. Zelethkin corrected, which is the only language they truly understand. "You gave them a choice between a military victory that would cost them their empire and a diplomatic retreat that preserves their pride. They chose survival. Their pride is not preserved," Elena said. "Everyone knows they threatened, and we refused, and they blinked first." "Yes," the Arbiter agreed. "And that is perhaps the most significant change of all." He was silent for a moment, his form shifting through colors of deep contemplation. "Ambassador, I've been thinking about what you said, about how our system rewards aggression by demanding that victims make concessions. I have been reviewing the history of Council arbitration, examining the patterns I never questioned before. What have you found?" "That you were right," he admitted. "Again and again, the Council has forced the weak to surrender something to the strong in the name of peace. We told ourselves it was necessary, that any compromise was better than war. But we never asked what kind of galaxy we were building." His voice carried a weight of regret that surprised Elena. "We built a galaxy where the powerful learned that aggression has no consequences, where the vulnerable learned that justice is always for sale, and where courage became extinct because it was never rewarded." Elena watched the ancient being wrestle with realizations that challenged everything he had believed for 30,000 years. "What happens now?" she asked. "I do not know," Zelethkin replied, "and that is both terrifying and wonderful. For the first time in my long existence, I cannot predict what comes next. The old patterns are broken, and new ones must emerge." He moved toward the window, looking out at the vast station and the stars beyond. 23 species have formally requested alliance with Earth. 40 more have opened independent diplomatic channels. The coalition of the 17 is already being called the Hope Compact, and more are asking to join. Elena rose and stood beside him. "We did not set out to start a revolution." "No," Zelethkin agreed. "You set out to protect 40,000 refugees. The revolution was simply what happened when the galaxy saw what real principles look like." 3 days later, Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood in the docking bay of Axiom Prime, preparing to board the UNSS Defiance for the journey home. The 17 species of the Hope Compact had gathered to see her off. Solani, Maradani, Calith, and all the others who had found their courage in that pivotal moment. Elder Koreth approached her. Moving slowly with the weight of his years, Ambassador, he said, taking her hands in his. Before you leave, I must ask you something that has haunted me since that day in the chamber. Ask. Elena replied. You stood against the entire Vorthani hegemony with nothing but words and principles. You faced the possibility of your species' extinction without flinching. How did you know it would work? Elena was quiet for a long moment, thinking of Captain Chun's report about the refugee transport, about the terrified families in the cargo hold, about the split-second decision that had changed everything. Elder Koreth. She finally said, I did not know. When I stood in that chamber and refused to bargain, I believed there was a very good chance we would all die. I believed that Earth might burn and humanity might become nothing more than a memory. The old Salvani's eyes widened. Then why? He whispered, why risk everything? Because some things are more important than survival, Elena replied. Captain Chun understood that when he put his ship between your people and the Vorthani, he did not calculate the odds or weigh the political consequences. He saw innocent people in danger, and he acted. She gripped Koreth's hands more firmly. That is what it means to be human. We are not the strongest or the smartest or the oldest. But we have learned through all our painful history that there are principles worth dying for. And when you are truly willing to die for something, when you have made peace with that possibility, you become something that cannot be bullied or bargained with. She released his hands and stepped back. We did not know if it would work, she repeated. We just knew that some things are not for sale. That knowledge gave us the strength to stand. And somehow, against all odds. It was enough. Cora stared at her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. For 200 years. My people accepted the bargains we were offered because we feared the alternative, he said. We thought we were being wise, being practical, being survivors. But all we were doing was dying slowly instead of quickly. He straightened his frail body with new determination. You have taught us that there is another way, not just to survive, but to live with dignity. Whatever comes next, the Selvani will remember that lesson. Elena smiled and reached out to touch his silver cheek. The lesson was always yours. Elder, we just reminded you of it. She turned and walked toward the airlock where her delegation waited. David Park fell into step beside her, his face carrying a mixture of exhaustion and wonder. Ambassador, he said quietly. What you did in there, what we all did, it was impossible. Every diplomatic manual, every strategic analysis, every historical precedent said we should have failed. Yes, Elena agreed. Then how did we win? Elena stopped at the airlock door and turned to look back at the gathered delegates. At the ancient station, at the galaxy that would never be quite the same, we did not win. David, she said, we simply refused to lose in the way they expected. The Vorthani prepared for a negotiation and found themselves facing something they did not understand, people who would not play their game. She stepped through the airlock onto the Defiance. The galaxy has run on bargains for 12,000 years. Everyone learned that everything has a price, that principles can be traded like currency, that the smart move is always to calculate and compromise. She looked back at her aide with eyes that held the weight of everything they had been through. We showed them that some of us never learned that lesson. And now they have to figure out what to do about people who cannot be bought, cannot be threatened, and will not bend. The airlock closed behind them, and moments later, the Defiance pulled away from Axiom Prime, its engines carrying it toward the distant blue dot called Earth behind them. The Galactic Council continued its ancient work. But something fundamental had shifted in meeting rooms and private chambers across 1,000 worlds. Beings were asking questions that had never been asked before. What if we said no? What if we demanded justice instead of accepting compromise? What if we stood together? The old order had not collapsed. It was too vast, too entrenched, too deeply woven into the fabric of galactic civilization. But it had cracked, and through those cracks, something new was beginning to grow. Ambassador Elena Vasquez watched the stars stream past the observation window and allowed herself a small smile. It was not the end of anything. It was a beginning. And for the first time in 12,000 years, the galaxy was uncertain about what would happen next. Good. Elena thought uncertainty means possibility, and possibility is how things change.